Chapter 7. Once they'd arrived at the cave, Paxton immediately started a fire. Both of them were tired and hungry, and appreciated the comfort of the flames. Elizabeth volunteered to go and catch some fish or game to eat, but Paxton informed her he'd brought provisions from town. He cooked a simple meal, and as they ate, Elizabeth filled him in on her history with Maxwell Stanton. Paxton's face darkened as she spoke, and when she concluded her tale, he tossed down his wooden plate and left the cave. Elizabeth put her head in her hands. She wondered if she'd been wrong not to tell her husband of the past, but she'd not wanted the past to affect their future. A now apparently futile attempt. If Paxton had known about Maxwell, they probably wouldn't own the ranch, and Paxton would either be dead or a murderer. Mrs. Raines sighed and envisioned the ranch, wishing she were back there with Pax, training a colt or planting in her garden. She recalled the first time she'd stepped into the ranch house and surveyed her new home. Their brand-new home, a ranch no less, was located east of the town and had been purchased shortly after their wedding night. Elizabeth had implored her husband not to search for a home too near the town. She desired no future contact with Maxwell Stanton, and didn't want to set up a scenario where it would be easy for the mayor to interfere and cause problems for them. Since she'd previously decided to avoid the past, she could not give Paxton a viable reason why they should leave the vicinity of her hometown. There were two reasons why she'd not insisted on moving territories altogether. Both were on account of her father. Deep down she hoped and prayed that he might one day return, and two, if he had been murdered, she wanted to bring his killer to justice. One way or the other, she'd have some sort of closure. The ranch was previously owned by one Jack Strom, a retired bounty hunter and friend of Paxton's. Jack was a tough old man, and it was probably his disposition, knowledge, and fearlessness that had kept him safe from Maxwell Stanton. That and the fact the ranch was about 15 miles from town. Strom had heard about Paxton's getting hitched, and had sent word that his ranch was for sale. Paxton and Elizabeth had spoken about the prospects of owning a ranch. For Elizabeth, the main deterrent was the concern that Paxton might resent having to retire from bounty hunting. "Lizzie, that would not be a problem, I assure you," he'd stated matter-of-factly. "I married you because I wanted to be with you. Do you think I'd want to leave you? To hunt criminals and perhaps get killed in the process?" "Well, I wouldn't want you to leave, but I could go with you, Pax, and help you." He looked at her incredulously. "Not on your life, literally. Elizabeth Kent was—" "Paxton, I can take care of myself. I don't want you to give up anything because of me. That lifestyle would be exciting, and I could deal with it." "Could you deal with being shot, stabbed, scalped, kidnapped, or sold into slavery? Could you deal with me being dead?" "Never mind the dangers, Elizabeth. But what about—" his look softened. "A family? Don't you want to have children?" She blushed. "Of course. But that could wait a few years." Suddenly he grabbed her and held her close. "Elizabeth, I want the ranch. I don't need or wish to chase wanted people any more. That chapter of my life is closed, and I'm glad of it. This is what I want, honestly." "All right, if you're sure," Elizabeth conceded, realizing Paxton was sincere about his desire for a career change. She recalled the searing dread she'd felt when she'd thought Kent was going to kill Paxton, and she didn't want to face that feeling again. Ever. "Let's go and look at the ranch, Mr. Rain." Jack Strom had met them on the porch. His scruffy, rough appearance reminded Elizabeth of her father. He wasn't as tall as Paxton or her father, but he was built like a grizzly, with stocky muscles, broad shoulders, and a keen alertness. He was all friendliness now, but Elizabeth sensed, given the right circumstances, the old man could turn lethal. Jack held out his hand, and Paxton shook it. "How have you been, Jack?" "I'm getting old, boy." Strom glanced at Elizabeth with astute blue eyes. "You must be Mrs. Rain." He nodded slightly. "Truly a pleasure, ma'am." "Thank you, Mr. Strom." She held out her hand for a handshake, but he unexpectedly kissed it. "You were formerly Miss Elizabeth Dalton, were you not?" She concurred. "I knew your father." Strom's weathered face tightened, and he went quiet, as if lost in a memory. After a short moment he blinked and addressed Paxton. "Well, my boy, are you going to buy my ranch? If you do, I am planning a splendid retirement in New York. Ever been there, Elizabeth? It's a fine city." The two men immediately engaged themselves in conversation about the city. Elizabeth barely heard a word about New York, as she was distracted by her own curiosity. What had Strom meant by mentioning her father so briefly? And then, why had he looked so distant? Was he merely sorry for the situation, or did he know something else? "Elizabeth," Paxton seized her hand, dispelling her reverie. "You there, honey?" He grinned. "Jack wants to show us the house." "I do apologize," she blushed, realizing they'd been trying to get her attention for some time. "I'd love to see inside." Walking up the front porch steps and through the front door, she saw a plain but clean sitting room, a large oak kitchen with several cupboards, a sink, stove, and plenty of counter space. The dining room was well furnished, as was the bedroom. "It needs a woman's touch, ma'am. My wife moved up to New York some years ago. She missed the city, and I never was home much with bounty hunting, running a ranch and all," Strom said. "But from what Paxton tells me, you make a fine home, even from a cave." "What do you think, Lizzie?" Paxton asked. "It's perfect," she beamed. "I couldn't have planned a better layout myself." Jack smiled. "Well, I'm glad you like it. I'll be leaving all of the furniture here, and there is room for an addition," he added tenderly. "I never needed more room, but I think you might. Now I'll show you the bunkhouse for the hired hands. You know, boy, I don't think I could have parted with my ranch to anybody but you two. I know you'll take care of it." Jack had been right. Elizabeth and Paxton had worked the ranch for a year. The ranch's prosperity tripled, and they loved their home, which Elizabeth had decorated, and, as Jack had put it, added a woman's touch. Neither one of them had realized they'd attracted the attention of Mayor Stanton. His ranches were losing business as theirs increased in value. Paxton was an honest, trustworthy, hard-working man, and people were drawn to him. Elizabeth was sweeping her porch, and Paxton was out running the horses when Maxwell Stanton and his carriage arrived. Wishing she could go inside and shut the door in his face, Elizabeth greeted him coldly. "Seems you and your husband are quite the talented ranchers." His tone was cool. "I learned a lot from my father," she stated acidly, "and Paxton is good at anything he does." Maxwell scowled, came closer to her, and whispered, "So, he makes you happy then?" "Very." She backed away from him and was relieved to see Paxton riding in. "Why have you come here, Mayor Stanton?" He smiled wickedly. "Why, to see my lovely ward. I wanted to make sure you're being well taken care of." His eyes shifted as he realized Paxton was approaching. He raised his voice. "I also wanted to see the competition." Paxton did not take Maxwell's outstretched hand. He went straight over to Elizabeth. "Is everything okay?" he asked her. "Of course it is, my dear fellow," Maxwell answered for her. "The lovely Elizabeth and I were just getting reacquainted, that's all. Your ranch is really quite something, Rain. I wouldn't mind owning some of it." "I understand your sentiments, Mr. Stanton. I don't mind owning all of it," Paxton said firmly. Maxwell grinned, calculating how he'd love to be rid of Paxton and take Elizabeth and the ranch for his own. "I actually came out here to warn you both. There has been some cattle thieving in the area. Several of my own ranches have been hit, and the sheriff and I have been unable to catch the perpetrators." "Did you try looking among your own people?" Elizabeth asked slyly. Both Maxwell and Paxton picked up on the insinuation. "I like to believe that the men working for me are trustworthy, Elizabeth," Stanton drawled. "But perhaps you are right, and I am being too idealistic. And yet, I've heard your cattle numbers are doubling, and I was just wondering if maybe your employees are the ones I should be investigating." "How dare you bring your veiled threats here?" Elizabeth steamed, but Paxton quickly intervened. "Naturally, you and the sheriff are welcome to come and investigate any time, Mr. Stanton. I was just out with my stock today, and they're all of my mark, I assure you. I've purchased some cattle from down south. The number of cattle is outlined on the deed, and Jack Strom included the number of horses and cows he sold to us in the deed to the ranch as well. The number is no more or less than what is indicated in those two deeds." The mayor's face darkened. "Deeds can be forged, Rain." "Yes, they can," Paxton agreed amiably. "That's why I thought it was important that 3 witnesses and a justice of the peace oversaw each transaction." "How clever." Stanton assessed his enemy and realized once again that it would not be easy to bring down Paxton Rain. Certainly, he'd have to resort to more devious means than his usual methods of intimidation. "I believe in honest business, Mr. Stanton. Your stock is safe from me. But, by all means, bring the sheriff, if it would rest your mind as to my innocence." Maxwell considered planting some of his cattle and framing Rain, but as he glared into his eyes, he realized Rain would be expecting this. The truth was there had been no cattle raids, and the townspeople were aware of this. Rain was popular among the people, and Stanton didn't want to damage his own reputation by a weak attempt at framing. Anything he got on Rain would have to be pretty solid or pretty secret. "No, Mr. Rain, that will not be necessary." He skimmed the rim of his hat with his fingers, then replaced it on his head. "Good day to both of you, Elizabeth, Rain." He nodded sharply and turned to leave, but stopped. "By the way, Elizabeth," he grabbed her hand, kissed it fervently, and noted with satisfaction how Elizabeth flinched and Paxton shifted uneasily. "You look enchanting, my darling." Heading toward his carriage, Maxwell grinned to himself as a plan of vengeance formed in his mind. Destroying Paxton would be easier than he'd first thought. When Paxton finally returned to the cave, his demeanor was somber. He sat down across from Elizabeth, picked up a long stick, and poked at the fire. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier, Paxton. I was just afraid it would endanger our lives together. I didn't want Maxwell to have any power over us," she explained anxiously, distraught by the length of his absence and his now solemn silence. He looked her way and remarked quietly, "I'm not angry at you, Elizabeth. You believed you were right not to tell me. Your reason being that you feared I'd have wanted to avenge your father's death, and might have caused more harm than good in the process." He plunged the stick firmly into the fire, knocking a propped-up log down onto the fiery red embers. "You did what you thought was right. That's all. The man has injured you immensely, and your personal vendetta perhaps overshadowed your knowledge of my character. I think," he glanced at her warily, "I hope you now realize I would not act against Maxwell Stanton without careful and purposeful consideration beforehand. If all you've revealed to me about the mayor is true, and he actually murdered your father, then he is a malevolent adversary indeed. We're already aware of how well he manipulated us, and almost cost me my life." He tossed the stick into the fire and watched as the flames engulfed it. "To think I was jealous of him, and all this time you really did despise him." His mind flashed back to the day Maxwell first visited their ranch, and the jealousy that had seared him. Stanton took Elizabeth's hand and kissed it. "You look enchanting, my darling." Elizabeth had visibly trembled. Paxton had believed that reaction was out of chemistry and not disgust. He watched Maxwell leave and looked at Elizabeth. She didn't say anything, only turned and went into the house. That night he'd lain awake, pondering his wife's relationship with Stanton. He'd heard that Elizabeth's father had left his ranch and the care of his daughter to Stanton, and Elizabeth had stayed there under his roof for several years. She left at the age of 17, probably because they'd had a lover's quarrel. That explained her cool attitude toward the mayor. He remembered that Stanton claimed Mr. Dalton wanted Elizabeth to marry him. His stomach twisted painfully as he wondered why his wife told him so little about the past, which involved Maxwell Stanton. Elizabeth stirred and rolled over to face him. "Pax," she said sleepily, "what's wrong?" She nuzzled close to him and kissed his shoulder. "Is there anything I can do to help you get to sleep?" she asked seductively, smoothing her fingertips over his chest. He seized her hand and squeezed it lovingly. "Exactly what was your relationship with Stanton?" She stiffened instantly, remarking tightly, "Nothing. I hate him, Paxton." He looked at her. "Love and hate are on a thin line, Lizzie." Her eyes had widened. "Paxton, please don't ask me about that horrid man. Just rest assured I love you, and only you." She kissed him ardently, which caused him to forget his concerns for that moment. 2 months later, he'd returned from the fields to discover Elizabeth was gone. She'd left a note informing him she'd gone to town and said she'd be back late. It was well after dark when a man wearing a sheriff's badge appeared at his door and told him he was under arrest for the theft of the mayor's cattle. He knew this was a trap, and would have struggled if the impostor hadn't pointed out that Elizabeth was waiting for him at the jailhouse. The implied threat was evident to Paxton, and as the bogus sheriff had intended, Paxton went with him quietly. Upon entering the jailhouse, he was brutally struck on the back of the head and knocked out cold. He awoke, locked in a cell, with Maxwell Stanton glaring at him. "I warned you I was aware of your illegal activities, Rain. If you had only refrained from stealing my stock, you would not be here right now." "I never stole from your stock, Stanton, and you know it," he steamed as angrily as he could with the pounding head. "That's why the real sheriff is not here. isn't it?" "There are 3 witnesses. They saw you leading several of my cows off my premises, and they will testify to this," he continued when his adversary did not reply. "Elizabeth wants to speak with you now, Mr. Vrain." Elizabeth entered just after Maxwell left. Her face was pale and extremely grim. Refusing to look at him, she denounced him as her husband and rebuked him harshly. Cruelly, she declared she wanted to marry Maxwell and to be rid of the last name of Vrain. She begged him to sell the ranch to Maxwell and to leave town. It would be better for everyone concerned, she'd said icily. Each phrase she used stabbed at him deeply, leaving him feeling increasingly bereft. It was as though his will to live was draining away with every insult. If she no longer wanted him, what was left? It was just a day later that Paxton's food had been drugged, and he woke up in the process of being tied to that oak. "You were jealous of him?" Elizabeth asked blankly, bringing her husband back into the present. "But I thought you knew how much I hated him." "It's a lot easier to understand when I know the reason," he replied. "I assumed you'd had a relationship with him and he jilted you, or the 2 of you had a lover's quarrel or something." Elizabeth laughed coldly. "No." "Well, tomorrow we need to discuss what will be done. I bet Stanton's taken possession of our ranch, and will not rest until he has his way. Until—" Paxton looked meaningfully at his wife. "Until he has you. But right now it's late, and I'm tired." He admired her for a moment, relieved he'd followed her after she'd rescued him from the oak tree, despite what she'd told him in the jail. Aware all these troubles would still be present tomorrow, he decided he didn't want to spend any more time contemplating what was to be done about them. Right now, he wanted to show his wife how glad he was to have her back, and how much he'd missed her. He smiled mischievously at her and huskily commanded, "Come here, beautiful."